Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Dr. Roland Betancourt's story begins far from the theme parks and automation systems we might associate with his latest work. It begins instead with images, icons, and mosaics, the shimmering light of Byzantine churches, and the strange feeling that these medieval worlds still have something urgent to say about our own. Over time, that curiosity led him from the classrooms of the University of Pennsylvania to the halls of the Yale University and eventually to the University of California, Irvine, where he now serves as Chancellor's Professor of Art History in the School of Humanities and as an affiliate faculty in Religious Studies and Classics. Across his career, Professor Betancourt has kept running to a single powerful question. How do ways of seeing shaped centuries ago continue to structure the worlds we inhabit today? To answer it, he moves fluently between Byzantine art and theology, the histories of science and technology, and the textures of modern popular culture. This journey has taken form in four major books. In Sight, Touch, and Imagination, in Byzantium, he explores how medieval viewers encountered scared images. In Byzantine, intersectionality, sexuality, gender, and race in the Middle Ages, he uncovers the complex social worlds of Byzantium, a work that went on to receive the Jerome Singerman Prize and become a finalist for the American Academy of Religions Award of Excellence. Performing the ghazals in Byzantium brings to life the sounds and spaces of the divine liturgy, while the secrets we keep hidden histories of the Byzantine Empire invites readers into stories long overlooked in the traditional canon. These books are only one part of a wider intellectual landscape. Professor Betancourt's essays and edited volumes range from race and gender in medieval societies to the algorithms and aesthetics of YouTube and contemporary media, always asking how power, identity, and technology are woven together in what we watch and how we look. His scholarship has been recognized and sustained by a Guggenheim Fellowship, a 3-year Chancellor's Fellowship at UC Irvine, the Elizabeth and J. Richardson Dilworth Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and an Andrew W. Mellon Professorship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. Alongside his research, he helps shape the field more broadly as editor for ICMA Viewpoint series at Pennsylvania State University Press and the Middle Ages series at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and is a member of editorial and advisory boards of leading journals such as Speculum, Explanaria, and Yelek, Annual of Istanbul Studies. In each of these roles, he is not only interpreting the past, but also curating the conversation that will define its future study. Today, his work turns to some unexpected but deeply revealing sides, Disneyland and queer aesthetics. In his current projects, Disneyland and the aesthetics of automation and queer Byzantine. Camp Access Aesthetics, Professor Betancourt brings together factory floors and theme parks, medieval icons, and camp performance to show how technologies of automation and modes of access have been made pleasurable, even magical in modern life. It is a continuation of the same question that has guided him from the start. How the systems that organize our world, material, visual, and technological become natural to us, and how looking closely can make them visible again. Professor Roland, we are truly delighted to welcome you on Business Talk today. The honor, without question, is entirely ours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Professor, in the book, you argue that Disneyland functions as a kind of factory where the product on the assembly line is the guest experience itself. How did you arrive at this way of seeing the park, and what changes once we start looking at Disneyland as a machine rather than just a storytelling space?
Yeah, when I began this project, I wanted to think of a story of Disneyland that was different from all the things that we usually hear. I wanted to tell a story that was, of course, unique And there's so much literature and so many people want to contribute as to what makes a theme park special, why it has such an important draw in society over the years, in the present. And I really spent a lot of time thinking about what is it that really enchants people about these spaces, because I think that there are a lot of other places in the world where there are these elaborate themed environments. But one thing that I realized very early on was how much of that power that this type of theme park holds is the fact that these experiences are not just, walk through experiences in the same way that perhaps if you went to a Gothic cathedral, you might experience this sort of heavenly space by walking through a very overpowering space that uses all the senses. I realized that technology was a really big part of this experience in a way that has been discussed in terms sometimes of animation and the history of film, but never in the technologies themselves. And I think Disney, the company itself, has also thought for a very long time that in many ways the technology is a thing that you're supposed to hide away. That is not the most seductive or enchanting part of the experience. It's the storytelling. But what I wanted to do was to be able to give us new eyes to recognize the technology, to understand the story that it is telling along the storytelling in the conventional sense, so that people could follow along on what is so unique about the moment in which this emerges and how technology really plays into this narrative storytelling. And I think that's one of the things that really sets my research apart, is looking at the way in which the sort of a nuanced and deep understanding of technology can actually help us understand things like storytelling, which I think we often separate. We often think of art on the one hand and technology. And I think the theme park has, especially with the concept of Imagineering, Disney has very much leaned into this idea of bringing the two together. But in reality, we often tend to sort of ignore the technology for the sake of the more conventional artistry.
Professor, you trace the book back to Walt Disney's exposure to post-war industrial sites like Ford's River Rough plant and to broader anxieties about automation and job loss in 1950s in America. What were the key historical moments or technological encounters that most clearly convince you Disneyland was an answer to those fears?
Yeah, when I began the project and really started thinking to myself that, it's the technology, the sort of movements of these attractions, the sort of unspoken ways in which they demonstrate these very powerful machines was important, I then began to think more historically. I would say that this project was about 6 months or so of really spending time in the theme park and thinking, what is unique about this space? How does it operate today? And then very quickly from there, it was this real urge and desire to understand historically what this would have been like in the 1950s. Because I think that it's very easy whenever we work on any space that has endured over time to take our experience in the present and project it back into the past. And for me, it was really about understanding what was unique. And that's when I began to look into this sort of history of automation technology. And I was very struck by the fact that the term automation was not in our popular vocabulary until 1952. And that really, in the years that Disneyland was being designed and opened, automation became the most pressing concern of the moment, very similar to the way that AI plays its role today. And so for me, that was really a moment where I could understand that my interest in this technology was not just an artifact of my own experiences with theme parks, but rather also a very historically determined conversation that really stretches back. And I think this is, again, speaking of past studies on Disney, there's this understanding that Walt Disney was always very interested in technology. And that is true. And even those who worked at the Ford commented on the fact that every time that he came to visit, he was very interested in anything mechanical. And that is why he loved going to the Ford, not only because of the plant itself, but also because of the museums on the Ford campus that really had a history of technology and machines, with the automobile and so on. And so these were the things that really attracted him to these spaces. And I think that one of the things that we see throughout Walt Disney's career in the amusement park and the theme park, really, which is only about just over 10 years, given his death in 1966, is that he oftentimes was drawn to technologies and said, how can we make this into an attraction? And so this real understanding that sometimes it wasn't just that technology offered something unique that could be done with it, but sometimes that technology was so impressive that he wanted to understand, how can I translate this into an amusement park ride? How can I make this into an experience? Because there's something here that's so awe-inspiring technically that you want to share that experience with guests. And so I always use the example of a ride like Peter Pan's Flight, which takes you on this sort of flying journey through, the sets of Peter Pan, let's call it. And there, what they were using was an industrial conveyor to give you that experience of flying. It was an overhead monorail that moved heavy objects in a warehouse. And so I think that that was a great moment of always explaining the ways in which there was this real sort of seduction by what the machines were, and this idea of like, how can we turn this into an attraction that can therefore elevate the narrative through that sheer technological wonder.
Professor, could you walk us through one of these examples in detail and explain what it reveals about the mindset of Disney's engineers?
Yeah, so I think Peter Pan is a great place to start, but it really is a history that throughout the amusement parks legacies has really been quite critical. When we look back at the early days of a place like Coney Island, you think of a lot of the attractions that we associate with the parks of the turn of the century. And it's oftentimes rides like mine car rides or log flume rides, these attractions that have inherent associations with industry, with these types of ways of conveying heavy goods throughout either their extraction or the factory. And what I also think is so interesting about an attraction like a mine car ride, which of course we also find in a place like Disneyland in its own sort of iteration as Thunder Mountain, is that you have this desire to offer a public a type of industrial experience that is sometimes too dangerous for them to experience, or that is just beyond their bounds in a mine far away, or, that's too dangerous to enter. Or you even have the factory, which would have been closed off to most people. One of the things that I found so interesting in doing the research on the Ford's River Rouge is that they had a very dramatic and public tour of the factory. So there was this real amusement park feel, almost more so a theme park feel, to the way in which they presented that technology, which I think was really impressive to Walt Disney in sort of unifying the sort of aesthetics of technology as such. But throughout the history of amusement parks to this day, we see the ways in which engineers are always looking to what factories are doing in order to create new forms of experience for guests that are not purposely, I don't think, introducing them to factory technologies, but that are using factory technologies like mechanical arms, for example, that manufacture cars, and using them to create a new type of experience that you couldn't have anywhere else. But what I argue throughout my book is that as a consequence of that, what you begin to see is how amusement parks begin to give the public an entryway to understanding technologies that are completely closed off from their daily lives, but that really manufacture and produce and transport and circulate just about every object around us. And so I think that that's one of the things that the theme park really offers us today, is that it begins to give us a window into these systems that are so critical to our lives, but so removed from view.
Professor, audio-animatronics becomes a kind of emblem for Disneyland's automation. McCows in the Tiki Room, Mr. Lincoln on stage, and so many figures throughout the park. How did this technology evolve in the park's first 3 decades? And what do you think made it such a powerful vehicle for making automation feel friendly instead of threatening?
Yes, I think a lot about today the ways in which so many of our AI machines and so many of our automated technologies that we see are, given cute faces and cute names. There's always this desire to name robots, to anthropomorphize them. These mechanical arms, of course, are always discussed as arms. And companies in particular lean heavily into this idea. And I think that this is something that for Disney trying to create an experience like the Tiki Room or Mr. Lincoln, there was this desire to use whatever technology was available to create this experience. I think what it does, and this is something that I trace, especially in the conclusion of the book, is that what you see is that by within like 2 decades, you really have this moment where a lot of these technologies become so heavily associated with the theme park that they are sort of technological presences in our life almost become, described as theme park rides because this technology is something that now people they know that are in the factories, but they're ultimately things that have become so iconic of what the theme park experience associated with Disney look like. And it is a sort of transformation that happens more broadly in the 1950s, where, and this is something that one of my colleagues in Southern California has traced very nicely, the way that even the image of the robot goes from this sort of ominous, terrifying thing to this sort of friendly thing, this toy, during the course of the 1950s and in the post-war period more broadly. And so you really have this movement where I think Disney plays a very important role in where a lot of technology, not only sort of the automaton or the animatronic becomes associated with the Disney experience, but also all these types of systems that I've been describing, these overhead monorail conveyors, these more sort of procedural computer systems really start to be associated with what you experience in a theme park because it is the access point that many have. And so it becomes a way in which I think now we see how we've really adapted as a society, very, very broadly, this idea of making so much of our technology anthropomorphic in some way. All of our AIs tend to have a name in order to make them less threatening, more accessible, and to also, I think, Disneyfy them in a way that sort of uses that legacy of Disney to really make them seem cute and less perhaps threatening. And I don't think that we necessarily think that, Claude or ChatGPT is threatening on a daily basis, but I think that it softens the anxieties that we might have around the questions about AI or automation that are on people's minds. Certainly.
Professor, in the book, you show that Disneyland helped domesticate and aestheticize the power of industrial and military automation at a moment when unions, workers, and the public were deeply worried about being replaced by machines. How does the park's automated infrastructure reshape conversations about labor, risk, and responsibility, both in the 1950s and for us now in an era of AI and platform automation?
That's a really great question. The questions, I think one of the things that's become very interesting to me, especially reflecting, even after I wrote the book and reflecting on the state of conversations about automation and AI today, is how much theme parks, what they really offer truly. And, I make broader arguments in the book that, they aestheticize these technologies. Of course, like I said, they make them cute, they make them less worrisome, they make them a place of leisure where, the families that might be very active in their unions are still going for, respite and their free time. And so I think that definitely has these broad cultural functions. But one of the things that I've really sort of struck upon recently has also been the fact that the theme park also, I think, has often fallen outside of the conventional jurisdiction of a lot of industries. So, for example, I think a lot about the fact that there's so much conversation at the moment about AI creators. So, a figure like Tilly Norwood, who is this AI generated actress. And there's, of course, all these concerns about actors being digitized and then, in the future being just produced through AI. And there's been a lot of activism, rightly so, in the Hollywood unions to address these issues, impose like taxes on the use of AI. And what's really interesting, on the other hand, is that then when you look at Disney, for example, they're also beginning to debut AI characters like the walking, freestanding, free moving Olaf that has appeared in some of their theme parks, and that I think is a model for what they're going to do more in the future. And so that also demonstrates that the theme park, and that really hasn't received any outrage. And I think that it demonstrates something very unique about how the theme park sort of falls outside of these conventional boundaries in many ways, and so becomes a place for experimentation, especially for the entertainment industry, of what is possible in this sort of third space that doesn't feel as regulated by the broader concerns of Hollywood. And I think that's definitely something that you can see in the 1950s when Disney decided to, make essentially a deal with the devil and produce a television show as a motion picture studio, which was very controversial, to promote his amusement park. And so we're seeing that sort of legacy sort of being experimented with today. And it's very interesting because his Imagineers, in the 1960s, when they were developing the Lincoln animatronic, I think that was a moment where for a lot of them, there was a bit of hesitation. It was one thing to produce animatronic birds. Of course, they can't sing and dance, but what is it when we're replacing a human with animatronics? And Walt Disney allegedly said to one of his Imagineers that was expressing concerns, well, no one could play Lincoln the way that an animatronic could play Lincoln. It wouldn't be sort of fair. And of course, there were applications to many other human roles at the same time. So that story doesn't really hold up much. But it's a very similar conversation that you could have about Olaf. Well, nobody could, of course, play this miniature robot in the way that Disney has designed it. And so I think that there are these sort of spaces that allow for a lot of play and creativity in its own right that also falls outside of the traditional boundaries of what sort of the conventional labor unions are looking at and the broader conversations that are being had in an industry. And so I think it's a place of, concern, but also sort of interest because of the ways in which they're playing with the theme park as this sort of other place.
Professor, the book highlights how Disneyland engineers sought to eliminate the unreliability of human workers. Say, the ride operator who could push the wrong button or suddenly fall ill. How do you interpret that impulse ethically and politically? And what does it tell us about corporate visions of safety, control, and efficiency in both mid-century theme parks and today's automated environments?
Yes, I think that Disney certainly was and continues to be in many ways a model of how do you mediate what many at the time referred to as the human element, which could be, of course, both the good and the bad of human beings as workers. And I think that that's something we still very much associate with Disney, this understanding that the behavior of their employees is very well trained, that the sort of is allowed to happen in the park, how they sort of control guests, how they move them, all these things. There's this real sort of inflated, hyperinflated idea of how much control Disney has over not only the actions of their workers, but also the actions of their guests. And that is really something that goes well beyond before the time of Disney. Of course, it can be traced back to the sort of desire to tabulate and understand the work of the movements of workers by so many early 20th century sociologists and writers that really wanted to understand, how to create the most efficient workspace. By the 1950s, there's also this concern about how dehumanizing labor on an automated line can be. So, before when people like the Gilberts are doing these time lapse studies of, what does it take for a surgeon to do a stitch or for a worker to drill something, you're talking largely about manual labor. And so there's this desire to understand, how do you make more efficient manual labor? At this point in the 50s, there's a real understanding that the assembly line and also automation is very dehumanizing, that people are very far away from one another. They're no longer necessarily interacting, that there is sort of this sort of destitute worker that needs some sort of like way of repairing their psychological space, which is why questions like leisure come in. And also, questions of fatigue. How do you make sure that someone doesn't fall asleep on the line because their work is so monotonous and redundant? And these are things that were very important also for amusement park leaders from 30s, 40s, and 50s and onward. This real desire to understand, how do we make fail safes? Because the difference, of course, between a factory worker and someone in an amusement park, which is essentially operating as a factory worker, is that you have to be aware that while, of course, injuries can happen on a factory, the things that are being conveyed in the amusement park are not heavy machinery, but rather human beings. And so the risk becomes so much more serious there, and especially human beings that are often children and families. And so there was this real desire to understand, what happens if someone operating a roller coaster has a heart attack? How do you have fail-safe, dead man controls? And so this is something that really it predates Disney, but that Disney really leans into, is this idea of how do we produce fail safes to ensure that that human element is as controlled as possible. And I really do see that as something that stretches not only from technological innovation and how do you produce systems that fight back against sloth and error and malice, but also, these robust training programs that produce these workers that are very sort of normalized in the idea of how they should operate, and to essentially have standard operating procedures for any possible event that could happen. And I think that's something that is there from day one of the amusement park in 1955 at Disneyland, but is something that, of course, has grown over the years and very much synonymous with the Disney brand. This idea of really trying to purge or produce fail safes for, the human element of this type of labor.
Professor, you write about attraction as layered experiences, the narrative or fantasy on the surface, and the hidden choreography of tracks, sensors, and control systems underneath. If we write the Matterhorn and Haunted Mansion with your book in mind, what should we pay attention to differently, and how does that awareness change what it means to have fun in the park?
I love that question because the first thing that I will tell everyone, and I am trained as an art historian, so I think people often would assume that the visual is the most important for me. But as in much of my other work, I will say that sound is probably the first thing I would say. I think that sound in is probably one of our most underdeveloped senses in how we experience the world sometimes. I think, especially in the conditions of our modern world where we're so constantly overwhelmed with noise, busy urban spaces with so much noise, I think there's something really powerful about listening carefully. And I think starting with the idea that what you're hearing is not just noise, but rather sort of like listening to a symphony, that there might be a totality that we experience, but it can be parsed out. And I think that's something really important for any guest, any visitor to an amusement park, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be Disneyland, to just listen first and to really be present in how you are listening, to understand, take some time to try to distinguish sounds. And I think it's a really interesting experience to do in a place like an amusement park, because you begin to hear so much and perceive so much about not only attractions, but how people are experiencing them. The screams of a roller coaster, the silence of a roller coaster. But for me, I think that also is a gateway to technology. You have that signature tick, tick, tick as you go up on a roller coaster, all these different sounds that say so much, the sound of brakes closing behind you, that they reveal the sort of processes of how these systems work. And so I think that that for me is something that's really critical because it's also a part of the experience that is the most difficult to obscure. It's very, you can blast the music and add other effects as much as you can, but you ultimately can't really silence that type of technology. And I think part of the reason is while we might be able to find ways of making it quieter, I think a lot of it often is that um, there is a certain level that it's almost seen that that's not really a part of the experience that needs to be silenced because no one's really paying attention to it. And so I think that it's a really powerful way of sort of hearing the often unspoken stories that the technology is telling. And I think what that does is that throughout many pockets, especially of the fandoms of Disney, there's a real desire to know, how does it work? How do rides work? How do these experiences get manufactured for us, designed for us? And I think that that's a really powerful way of really getting a sense of that sort of hidden story. And so I think that for especially Disney fans, there's a real desire to understand how these experiences operate. And that's a great entry point because it begins to tell a sort of very parallel story that you can experience as you're going through the attraction. And I think that that's also a really great experience, even for someone who has no interest in the theme park, that's just there casually, because it's such a wonderful way of reminding us that how much we sort of block out in our world visually, but also sonically, just as a way of sort of moving through the world. And I think that reminding us that there is meaning to every sound, even if it's overwhelming or seems nonsensical, is a great way of really sort of having forcing us to ask questions like, what is this? How is this happening? What are the various parts that make this up together? And so I think it's a really great way of experiencing an amusement park anew, especially for those who are, you know, devotees of these types of spaces.
Professor, Disneyland is often described as a space of total immersion and magic. Yet, you invite readers to notice the very things the park trains us to ignore: the noises, rhythms, and flow of automation. What kinds of methods did you use as a historian to study these hidden systems? And how might visitors learn to see those automated infrastructures for themselves?
Yeah, so I think that's, essentially, as I was saying, there's a very, I think there's an incentive to learn more in the theme park because ultimately I do see it as a place of learning about our world. It's a great place to have this exposure to these systems full on and then be able to take that knowledge to the outside world and think about how you'll then begin to recognize the sound of brakes, whether you're on a bus or any other mechanical system. And I think that the theme park is really a place to see through these layers. And I think the question of magic is really an important one because one of the things that I've often been very struck by is the fact of how Walt Disney wanted to show people how technology worked. In his Disneyland TV show, he gave guests before they had even gone to the park, the behind the scenes of how we're developing the technology, what we are doing, what are the challenges, because there was this desire to prepare them to not just go in and see Mr. Lincoln, but to understand the sort of heroic effort that went behind it. And I think that's something that's very much changed in our culture when we associate magic with not knowing how something is done, with that awe of like, how did he do that in the sense of a conventional, Las Vegas magician that you might go see. But I think that there is something that's very post-war, very mid-century America about this desire to understand that the awe of technology is so much a part of why the experience is meaningful. And so for me as an art historian and as a historian, it's very, it's one of these aspects that's so ephemeral about the experience of technology. But I think as an art historian, I'm also very attuned to understanding that so much of the work that I do has to be in some part reconstructive to try to understand and imagine what the experiences of past historical moments would have looked like. And so it's a really interesting challenge in approaching a theme park the way that I would approach a church or a manuscript in the Middle Ages, with this real desire to take it seriously and to understand how the totality of the experience comes together. And so I think that's something that my training as an art historian particularly set me apart from more conventional histories of technology. I was very much attuned and wanting to ask these questions about noises, rhythms, and flows that determine how we experience not only automation, but how that also becomes part of the narrative storytelling.
Professor, in what ways do you see Disneyland anticipating today's algorithmic, data-driven environments? And how might the park help us think differently about the automated systems that structure our daily lives outside the gates?
Yeah, I hope that I've been really communicating. I think theme parks are a really great space to have access to these massive technologies because, and I think that's one of the things that I really sort of struck upon in this project is that, even in the 1950s and 60s, I think automation becomes a term and we begin to associate it with the automatic, the idea that your dishwasher is automated. But dishwashers are not automated, at least not in the 50s. They are really automatic. They go through a set cycle, and whether your dishes are clean or not, they're going to go through that cycle and finish. Whereas automation had these feedback loops of saying, yes, that was done correctly, then we can move on to the next stage, or we have to, clean the dishes more because they're still dirty. And, I think that's the vision that was promoted in TV shows like The Jetsons, but not really the reality of how technology worked in the home. So really the theme park was the place where you did see these systems that had these feedback loops. And what I think is also really important is that this type of thinking was not just limited to the technology, but the theme park as a whole began to see itself as sort of this cybernetic feedback loop of making sure to, when the guests were leaving, have surveys and see how they responded to. And then those surveys could then go back to the designers and influence like the type of development that was happening in the park, which rides needed to be fixed, refurbished, changed, removed. So there was really this feedback loop that was instituted to the entire experience. And I think that in many ways really foreshadows the sort of algorithmic experience of our lives that we now inhabit. And I think what is great in many ways about the theme park is that it does this in very clear, piecemeal ways that I think are a great learning space for then, understanding that TikTok is very open about it's very immediate and you experience it. But I think the way that other platforms might do it more subtly in ways that you might not be as conscious about. And so I think the theme park continues to be this place where you can see how these processes of feedback loops became so critical. And it's, I think, something that really emerges out of this post-war period, this desire to translate sort of wartime technologies and systems and operations research into civilian life. And therefore, it creates an environment that is quite unique as a whole. And I think it's very much, we understand the amusement park to be a closed system, that, it's sort of what happens within these gates is a contained universe. And I think that speaks a lot even to the theories of cybernetics that existed in the period, which is again such a test space for understanding how in reality that closed space has really become our entire lives as this technology over the course of the late 20th century to the present was scaled up in ways that had a lot of applications that were fine-tuned through our entertainment experiences, because ultimately I think it is the entertainment aspect of a lot of these systems and technologies like TikTok that really seduce people in and bring them into that operation, into its operation. And so I think that that's the place that amusement parks have a lot to share, if you are willing and attuned to listen to the lessons that it has to offer and willing to sort of explore where it takes you and in parsing these things out.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For listeners who might think of Disneyland purely as nostalgia and escapism, what do you hope they take away from your argument that the park is one of society's earliest and most influential introductions to automation? And what questions should we will be asking about now how entertainment continues to normalize new technologies in the age of AI?
Yeah, you know, I've never been one for nostalgia. And I'm interested in escapism, but in very different ways. I think there's definitely an escapism to, you know, understanding technology and all that. I think there is something there that is part of that technological experience, which of course Disney himself knew very well. But I think that certainly the theme park, I think, is a great space to watch because what theme parks introduce, whether it be Disney or Universal Studios or the many other theme parks and amusement parks that exist throughout the world, one of the things they do very clearly is that as they introduce new technology, new ride experiences, they're not necessarily just developing this technology out of nowhere. They are oftentimes borrowing and translating this technology. And I think that when we shatter a little bit sort of that creative genius myth and allow ourselves to understand that theme parks are, it would be impossible for them to just develop technology from scratch, that they really are sort of working with others in the industry to translate this into entertainment experiences, it becomes a really important place to see piecemeal the technology that's coming into our world and understand that that technology is clearly at work in other spaces. And so I think that that's for me one of the things that a theme park does very well is that you begin to see the limits and opportunities that, you know, the hard systems like automation have, as well as those sort of the software systems of AI also have. You begin to see the way in which they're being introduced. And I think that's a really interesting process because it's also from even going back to day one of the park, it's not a process that happens, you know, a decade later. It's something that happens 2 or 3 years after oftentimes the development of a new technology. So I think that that's really one of the things of why where we should keep our eye on the amusement parks of the world because they are really bringing in technology and showing us what is new in this space. It's sort of in the sense that the World's Fair were about not only, you know, giving people fun experiences, but also showcasing the latest technology. I think amusement parks still do that. Maybe they don't have pavilions dedicated to the new technology alone, but they're still doing that through their attractions.
Listeners, we have had a truly illuminating conversation today. Seeing Disneyland not just as a place of stories and nostalgia, but as a living machine that quietly introduced generations to the power of automation. As we leave the park behind and step back into our own automated worlds of algorithms, platforms, and AI, the questions raised in this discussion stay with us. What kind of systems are shaping our lives? And how are they being made to feel natural, inevitable, even magical? On behalf of Business Talk, thank you for listening and special thanks to our guest, Professor Roland Betancourt, for opening up this hidden history of technology and entertainment. Professor Roland, it has been a privilege to host you on the show and thank you for sharing your work and your time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.